3 children, 3 funerals, and one family the world thought it knew. For more than 3 decades, the public saw Mia Farrow as the devoted mother of a remarkable family built across continents. But behind the photographs, behind the headlines, and far beyond the scandal that made global news, another story was quietly unfolding. A story of loss, loyalty, betrayal, and wounds that never truly healed. What happened to the 14 children raised inside one of Hollywood's most controversial families? And why did so many of them spend their lives searching for a version of home that seemed to vanish long before the cameras stopped rolling? Before the scandal, the dream that built a family. To understand how a family could carry so much love and still end up carrying so much loss, you have to go back long before the headlines, long before Woody Allen, long before the courtroom battles, the accusations, and the fractured loyalties that would divide siblings for decades. You have to go back to a little girl growing up in Hollywood. From the outside, Mia Farrow's childhood looked like something out of a golden era movie. Her father was an Academy Award-winning filmmaker. Her mother was a beloved movie star. The family lived among celebrities, privilege, and opportunity. It was the kind of life millions dreamed about. But families often hide their deepest cracks behind their brightest smiles. Behind closed doors, instability lingered. There were tensions, disappointments, and emotional absences that no magazine profile could capture. Then, at just 9 years old, Mia contracted polio. Suddenly, the glamorous world disappeared. Hospital rooms replaced family dinners. Isolation replaced comfort. And for the first time, she found herself surrounded by children whose lives had already been marked by suffering. Most people would eventually leave those memories behind. Mia never did. Something stayed with her, a lingering image of abandoned children, of vulnerability, of young lives waiting for someone to choose them. Years later, that memory would become more than compassion. It would become a mission. Not to raise one child, not 2, but an entire family. A family that would eventually stretch across continents, cultures, languages, and unimaginable personal histories. Perhaps Mia believed she was building the home she wished had existed when she felt alone. Perhaps she believed love could heal wounds that medicine, institutions, and time never could. Or perhaps she was chasing something even deeper, a sense of belonging large enough to outrun loss itself. What nobody knew then was that this extraordinary dream would one day collide with an equally extraordinary tragedy. And when it did, 14 children would find themselves living inside a story far more complicated than anyone on the outside could ever imagine. Building a family the world had never seen. If childhood planted the seed, adulthood became the experiment. As Mia Farrow entered Hollywood's spotlight, her life appeared to follow the script of a rising star. Television success led to movie stardom. Fame arrived. Wealth followed. Doors opened everywhere she turned. Yet while the world saw an actress becoming an icon, something else was happening beneath the surface. Mia wasn't chasing the life most celebrities dreamed of. She was chasing a family. Not the kind built by tradition, not the kind measured by bloodlines, but something larger. Something she believed could transcend history, geography, and pain. Her marriage to conductor André Previn marked the beginning of that vision. Biological children arrived first. Then came adoption. A little girl from war-torn Vietnam, another from the same country. A child from South Korea who had spent part of her early life on the streets before entering an orphanage. One by one, children arrived carrying stories no camera could capture. Different languages, different cultures, different scars. And somehow Mia believed they could all become one family. To outsiders, it looked extraordinary. Magazine covers celebrated it. Photographers captured images that felt almost symbolic, a famous actress surrounded by children from across the world, standing together like a portrait of hope itself. But photographs are strange things. They preserve appearances, not realities. What nobody could see inside those smiling family portraits were the invisible histories each child carried with them. Abandonment, illness, institutional care, trauma, loss. Love could offer safety, but could it erase what came before? That question would quietly follow the family for years, because while Mia was creating what many called a humanitarian miracle, she was also building something incredibly fragile, a household held together not only by affection, but by faith. Faith that enough love could overcome every wound. For a while it seemed possible. Then in 1980, a man named Woody Allen entered the picture. And without anyone realizing it, the countdown to one of Hollywood's most devastating family implosions had already begun. The years that felt perfect. For a time, it seemed as though Mia Farrow had done the impossible. The family kept growing. More children arrived from different corners of the world. Some came from orphanages. Some carried physical disabilities. Others arrived with emotional wounds no one could fully see. Yet somehow, the house remained full of life. And then came Woody Allen. When the two began their relationship in 1980, few could have predicted how deeply their lives would become intertwined. They never married. They never even lived together. He kept his apartment in Manhattan. Mia kept hers across Central Park. On paper, it was unconventional. But families are not built on paper. They are built on presence. And Woody was present. He appeared at holidays, family gatherings, weekend trips to Connecticut. He sat at dinner tables, attended celebrations, shared ordinary moments that slowly transformed him from Mia's partner into something much larger in the eyes of the children. A father figure. As the years passed, the family expanded again. Moses joined the household. Dylan followed. Then came Ronan. More adoptions. More responsibilities. More lives woven into the same complicated story. From the outside, these were the golden years. Mia starred in Woody Allen films. Critics praised their creative partnership. Magazine profiles portrayed them as one of the most fascinating families in America. The photographs showed smiling children running across the lawns of Frog Hollow, the family's Connecticut home. The images looked almost too perfect. And perhaps that's what makes them haunting now. Because perfection often hides what reality cannot. Behind every family portrait stood children carrying different histories, different needs, and different questions about where they belonged. Some had memories of abandonment. Some remembered institutions. Some remembered countries they would never see again. Yet the machine kept moving. School schedules, therapy appointments, birthdays, vacations, family dinners, life. For more than a decade, the structure held. Long enough for everyone inside it to believe it might last forever. But the most devastating collapses rarely begin with warning signs visible to the outside world. They begin quietly. One secret, one discovery, one moment that changes how every memory before it is understood. And in January 1992, that moment finally arrived. The Polaroids that changed everything. Every family has a before, and then there is the moment that creates the after. For the Farrow family, that moment arrived in January 1992. It began as an ordinary visit. Mia Farrow stopped by Woody Allen's Manhattan apartment, a place she had entered countless times before during their 12-year relationship. There was nothing unusual about the day. No warning, no dramatic confrontation waiting behind the door. Then she saw them. A collection of Polaroid photographs sitting in plain view. The images were explicit, and the woman in those photographs was Soon-Yi Previn, one of Mia's daughters. In an instant, 12 years of assumptions collapsed. To the outside world, the story would soon become tabloid gold. A famous director, a famous actress, a shocking relationship. Headlines practically wrote themselves. But inside the family, the damage was far more profound than scandal. This wasn't simply an affair. It was a rupture in reality. For years, Woody had occupied a unique place within the household. He wasn't legally a stepfather. He wasn't married to Mia. Yet many of the children had known him for most of their lives. He had attended birthdays, holidays, family gatherings. He was woven into the emotional architecture of the home. And suddenly, that architecture no longer made sense. The adults immediately began constructing competing versions of what had happened. Some viewed the relationship as a consensual bond between two adults. Others saw something far darker. But for the children, the legal arguments came later. The first feeling was confusion. The second was betrayal. Because once a person you trust crosses a line you never imagined possible, every memory becomes unstable. Every family photograph starts to feel different. Every holiday gathering acquires a second meaning. What had been certainty became doubt. What had been family became factions. And what had once looked like an extraordinary success story was beginning to reveal fractures that had been hidden for years. The public thought they were witnessing a celebrity scandal. In reality, they were watching the collapse of a family narrative. And the worst was still ahead. Because the Polaroids did not end the story. They only opened the door to a far more devastating chapter 1 that would drag the family into courtrooms, investigations, and accusations so explosive that decades later the world would still be arguing about what truly happened behind the walls of Frog Hollow. The allegation that divided a family forever. If the Polaroids shattered trust, what came next shattered certainty itself. In the months following the discovery of Woody Allen's relationship with Soon-Yi, the Farrow household was already struggling to survive. The adults were at war. Lawyers entered the picture. The media circled relentlessly. Every conversation seemed to carry the weight of a crisis waiting to happen. Then in August of 1992, everything changed again. This time, the center of the storm was not an adult. It was a 7-year-old girl. Dylan Farrow. According to Mia Farrow, Dylan disclosed that Woody Allen had sexually abused her during a visit to the family's Connecticut home, Frog Hollow. The allegation was explosive, far beyond infidelity. Far beyond betrayal. Woody Allen denied it immediately. And from that moment forward, two competing realities began to emerge. One version said a child had revealed a terrible truth. The other said a child had become trapped in a bitter custody battle between two adults. Investigators arrived. Doctors became involved. Therapists conducted interviews. Police reports were written, courtrooms filled with testimony. Yet, with every new inquiry, the picture seemed to become more complicated rather than clearer. What made the situation so devastating was not only the accusation itself. It was the fact that everyone involved believed they were fighting for the truth. Mia insisted she was protecting her daughter. Alan insisted he was defending himself against a false claim. And caught in the middle were children trying to understand a reality that no longer made sense. Imagine being a child in that house. One day you have a family. The next, every adult is asking you to choose sides. Every memory becomes evidence. Every relationship becomes a question. Every conversation feels dangerous. The courts would eventually make rulings. Investigators would issue conclusions. Lawyers would argue for years about what happened and what did not happen. But none of those outcomes could repair the damage already done, because something far more fragile than legal certainty had been destroyed. The family no longer shared a common story. Some children would grow up believing Mia. Others would grow up believing Woody. And that fracture would become permanent. Decades later, siblings who had shared the same house, the same dinners, and the same childhood photographs would publicly tell completely different versions of the past. Not because they forgot, but because the events of 1992 changed the meaning of every memory that came before them. And as the legal battle intensified, another tragedy was quietly taking shape. The family would survive the scandal. What many of its children would struggle to survive was the aftermath. Living inside the ruins. Most scandals end when the headlines disappear. Families don't. By the mid-1990s, the court hearings were largely over. The television cameras had begun looking elsewhere. Reporters moved on to newer stories, newer controversies, newer celebrities. To the public, the worst seemed finished. But for the Farrow children, the hardest part was only beginning. Because when a family breaks apart in public, there is no closing ceremony, no final verdict that suddenly restores trust, no moment when everyone agrees on what happened and starts over. Instead, people keep living, and they carry the fracture with them. Inside the Farrow household, the division was no longer temporary. It had become part of the family's DNA. Some children remained fiercely loyal to Mia. Others gradually drifted toward Woody's version of events. Many simply tried to survive between two realities that seemed impossible to reconcile. The family that once looked united now felt more like a collection of separate worlds occupying the same history. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part was that many of the younger children inherited the conflict without ever knowing what life had been like before it. Children such as Isaiah Quincy, Frankie Min, and especially Thaddeus arrived after the explosion had already happened. They weren't present for the golden years. They didn't remember the family before the accusations, before the custody war, before the bitterness. They inherited the aftermath. Imagine being adopted into a family whose defining trauma occurred before you arrived. You inherit the tension, the silence, the divided loyalties, but not the memories that explain them. For Thaddeus Farrow, that journey began thousands of miles away in Kolkata, India. He had survived polio. He had lived in an orphanage. He arrived in America unable to walk and unable to speak English. And yet, by all accounts, he embraced his new life with remarkable determination. For a while, he seemed to embody the promise Mia had always believed in. That love could rescue, that family could heal, that a difficult beginning did not have to determine the ending. But healing and happiness are not always the same thing. Beneath the surface, old wounds continued spreading through the family in ways nobody fully understood. Because while the world remembered the scandal of 1992, the children were living with something much more complicated: the burden of carrying incompatible truths. And over time, that burden would become heavier than anyone realized. Soon, the family would face something even more devastating than public controversy. Loss. Not one tragedy, not two, but three deaths that would forever change the meaning of the Farrow family story. The three funerals. The public remembered the scandal. The family remembered the funerals. That is the difference between a headline and a life. For years, people debated what happened inside the Farrow household. They argued about accusations, court rulings, and competing versions of the truth. But while the world was focused on the controversy, another tragedy was unfolding quietly in the background. The children were disappearing. The first loss came in 2000. Tam Farrow, a bright young woman adopted from Vietnam, died at just 17 years old. Her death received little public attention. No national headlines, no television specials, just a grieving family trying to absorb the unimaginable reality of losing a child. Then 8 years later, tragedy struck again. Lark Previn, one of Mia's earliest adopted daughters, died on Christmas Day in 2008. She was only 35. There was something haunting about the silence surrounding her death. Once again, the world barely noticed. The daughter who had once appeared in family photographs that fascinated millions faded from public memory almost overnight. 2 funerals, 2 daughters gone. And still, life moved forward. Or at least it appeared to. Then came September 21st, 2016. A quiet road in Connecticut. A parked car. Inside sat Thaddeus Farrow, the boy who had survived polio. The boy who had crossed an ocean from Kolkata in search of a future. The boy who had learned to drive despite paralysis and dreamed of becoming a police officer. By the end of that day, he was gone. Authorities ruled his death a suicide. He was 27 years old, 3 children, 3 funerals, 3 lives that had begun with extraordinary hardship and ended far too soon. And suddenly, the story looked different. This was no longer only a story about celebrity scandal. It was a story about grief, about the limits of love, about a mother who had spent decades trying to rescue children from suffering, only to watch some of them disappear despite everything she had done to save them. The family had survived public humiliation. But survival, it turned out, was not the same thing as healing. And as the years passed, the children who remained would begin telling radically different stories about what had happened inside the house they once called home. The children who chose different truths. After the funerals came something almost as painful. The realization that grief had not brought the family closer together. It had pushed them even farther apart. Most families survive because despite their disagreements, they share a common memory of what happened. The Farrow family lost that long ago. What remained were competing narratives, each carried by children who had lived under the same roof yet emerged with entirely different versions of reality. No one embodied that divide more clearly than Ronan Farrow and Moses Farrow. Ronan grew up firmly aligned with his mother. Brilliant, ambitious, and intensely driven, he transformed himself into one of America's most respected investigative journalists. In 2017, his reporting on Harvey Weinstein helped ignite the Me Too movement and earned him a Pulitzer Prize. To many observers, the symbolism felt impossible to ignore. A child raised in the shadow of one of America's most controversial abuse allegations had grown up exposing powerful men accused of abuse themselves. But while Ronan's voice became louder, another sibling's voice emerged from the opposite direction. Moses Farrow. Years after the scandal, Moses publicly defended Woody Allen and accused Mia of being the true source of pain inside the household. He described a childhood shaped by fear, favoritism, and emotional abuse. His account contradicted much of what the public had believed for decades. The reaction was explosive. Suddenly, the family wasn't divided by old events. It was divided by memory itself. Then there was Mia Farrow. For years, she remained largely silent. But as an adult, she stepped forward and publicly repeated the allegations she had first made as a child. Her words reignited a debate many believed had ended long ago. Woody Allen denied her claims once again. The public chose sides. The siblings chose sides. And the distance between them only widened. Perhaps that is the deepest tragedy hidden beneath everything else, not the scandal, not the lawsuits, not even the funerals, but the fact that 14 children who once appeared together in the same family photographs could no longer agree on what those photographs represented. Were they images of love, of rescue, of dysfunction, of survival? The answer depended entirely on which child was telling the story. And decades later, the battle over that story was still not over. In fact, the world was about to revisit it all over again. When the past refused to stay buried, most family secrets fade with time. This one grew louder. By the late 2000s, nearly 3 decades had passed since the events that shattered the Farrow household. New generations had emerged. Hollywood had changed. The world itself seemed different. And yet the past remained unfinished. Then came a cultural reckoning. The Me Too movement forced society to re-examine allegations that had once been dismissed, ignored, or buried beneath fame and influence. Suddenly, stories that had lived in the shadows were being pulled back into the light. The Farrow story returned with them. In 2021, the HBO documentary Allen vs. Farrow reignited one of the most controversial family narratives in modern celebrity history. Through home videos, court documents, and emotional interviews, viewers were invited back into the chaos of 1992. But what made the documentary so powerful wasn't simply what it revealed. It was what it couldn't resolve. Because even after decades, the same question remained. Who was telling the truth? How do we judge events we cannot fully witness? What happens when 2 people describe the same past in radically different ways? And what becomes of children forced to spend their entire lives defending their version of reality? As millions watched the old wounds reopen, one truth became impossible to ignore. The scandal had never truly ended. The court cases ended. The headlines faded. But the emotional trial continued. Year after year, decade after decade. And while the world debated who was right, an aging mother found herself carrying a different burden entirely. The memory of 3 children who would never have the chance to tell their stories again. Because beyond every accusation, every documentary, and every public argument stood an undeniable reality. 3 chairs at the family table would forever remain empty. What remains after everything falls apart? Around her, the family continues in fragments. Ronan Farrow built a career exposing powerful institutions. Mia Farrow built a life beyond the allegation that once defined her childhood. Moses Farrow continues to tell a radically different version of the family's history. Soon Yi remains married to Woody Allen decades after the relationship that changed everything first became public. And the younger children, those who inherited the aftermath rather than the beginning, have largely chosen lives away from the spotlight. Perhaps that is the most telling detail of all. For years, the world treated this family as a story, a mystery to solve, a scandal to debate, a cultural argument about power, abuse, memory, and truth. But families are not mysteries. They are people, and people do not live inside headlines. They live inside consequences. Some of those consequences became successful careers. Some became lifelong estrangements. Some became silence. And for 3 children, they became graves. When you look at old photographs of the Farrow family today, it is tempting to search for clues, to find the moment everything began to unravel, to identify the warning signs hidden behind the smiles. But perhaps there are none. Perhaps the harder truth is that families can be built with love and still break. Children can be rescued and still suffer. And 2 people can share the same home, the same memories, and the same history while carrying entirely different versions of what happened there. The public saw one of Hollywood's greatest scandals. The children lived something far more complicated, a lifetime. And maybe that is the real story that survived after everyone else moved on. Not who won, not who was right, but what it cost. And whether any family, no matter how famous, was ever meant to carry that weight alone.